Welcome to Native American history. Today we follow a single pictograph that held an entire winter's story, and through it, we'll read what the Lakota themselves marked as the year that changed everything. Winter counts are a visual chronicle used by Lakota communities to mark each year with a single memorable image. Samalstir. In their economy of signs, a pictograph stands for a winter's defining event and for the oral narrative that the image cues. This episode examines winter counts across the 19th century on the northern plains in the region now called North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, and Montana. The time frame spans early 1800s through the 1890s, when contact intensifies between Lakota bands and expanding Euro-American institutions. Principal actors include Lakota bandkeepers and elders, notably figures from Oglala, Hunkpapa, Minneconjou, and Brule communities alongside traders, Indian agents, missionaries, United States Army detachments, and later museum collectors and ethnographers who recorded or acquired the counts. The guiding question is precise. What do Lakota winter counts actually record in the 19th century? And how should historians read them as chronological evidence for warfare epidemics, treaty, councils' economic shifts, and environmental events on the plains? Significance is practical and methodological. Where written archives from forts, trading posts, and government offices are uneven or biased, winter counts supply local chronological anchors and reveal what communities deemed historically salient. They also present specific interpretive challenges. The counts compress complex events into single mnemonic images. They exist as living performance tied to keeper practice, and they were subject to copying loss and external collecting. Treating winter counts as raw data without attention to provenance, keeper lineage, and oral performance risks misdating, misattributing, or flattening contested memories. Answering the central question matters because winter counts alter how we sequence plains events and how we understand indigenous temporal frameworks. Read carefully. The counts can reframe epidemics, military encounters, treaty moments, and economic turning points, not as peripheral notes, but as primary chronological evidence from within Lakota communities themselves. The 19th century on the northern plains is best read as a sequence of interlocking pressures whose timelines often overlap and accelerate. By 1851, treaty negotiators met near Fort Laramie to delimit intertribal hunting ranges and travel corridors. By 1862, the Homestead Act opened new land claims to settlers. By 1868, a new treaty at Fort Laramie attempted to reconfigure reservation space. By 1869, the first transcontinental railroad reached the plains edge, and by 1874, exploratory and military expeditions reported gold in the Black Hills. Each of these dated moments altered patterns of movement, resource access, and diplomatic relations. Prelude timeline and legal markers begin with the Treaty of Fort Laramie 1851, which attempted to define territories and establish peace among plains tribes and newly arriving Euro-American traffic. The Homestead Act, 1862, incentivized family migration onto lands previously used seasonally for hunting. The Bureau of Indian Affairs Administration moved toward the Department of the Interior after the department's creation in 1849, shifting policy emphasis from strictly military oversight to civilian Indian agents and contract schooling. The Treaty of Fort Laramie 1868 attempted a new reservation order, but collided with accelerating commercial and military incursions. The Custer Expedition reports of 1874 and the subsequent influx of prospectors intensified contestation over the Black Hills. Land and resource pressures were material and rapid. Railroad grading and track laying created permanent transport corridors that invited homesteaders, supply depots, and commercial hunters. Commercial hunting and repeated market demand contributed to the catastrophic decline of bison herds that had sustained plains economies for generations. Mining and settler agriculture appropriated grazing and wintering grounds. The seasonal mobility that underpinned Lakota subsistence thus came under direct pressure from fixed property claims and extractive industries. Policy and administrative shifts compounded the material pressures. The transfer of Indian affairs into civilian interior management produced a framework of agencies, Indian agents, and boarding school contracts that prioritized assimilation and allotment as remedies. Military policy continued in parallel. Cavalry detachments enforced peace patrols, escorted surveying parties, and responded to reported raids. Agency rationing rules, the imposition of annuities, and the introduction of new legal claims through treaty interpretation created recurring points of friction at agencies and reservations. Education regimes and missionary activity sought to restructure domestic life and child rearing. Immediate triggers in local settings were often mundane but decisive. Arrests of band members on alleged crimes created local feuds. Disarmament orders or the seizure of horses disrupted mobility and defense. Sudden cuts or delays in promised rations produced acute winter stress for camps, reliant on agency supplies during poor hunting seasons. A harsh winter that reduced meat availability or destroyed stored hides could convert an administrative dispute into a crisis of survival. These proximate triggers frequently precipitated reactive raids, punitive military expeditions, and accelerated dispossession. For Lakota bands, the objectives were preservation of subsistence mobility, defense of seasonal ranges, maintenance of kin networks, and the negotiation of political advantage in a shifting landscape. Constraints included the loss of bison herds, reduced access to essential wintering areas, the spread of epidemic disease, and internal factional divisions over accommodation or resistance. Logistically, bands depended on mounted mobility, seasonal buffalo drives, and local caches of pemmican and hides. These logistical strengths were also vulnerabilities when fixed railheads and market hunters removed the resource base. For Euro-American actors, the objectives were land acquisition settlement, protection of communication and transport corridors, and the enforcement of federal treaty and property claims. Constraints included long supply lines for military detachments, limited troop numbers across a vast theater, seasonal weather that impeded movement, and the political complexity of negotiating with multiple independent bands. Logistically, the United States relied on fort supply wagons, telegraph lines, and railroad segments where available. Private contractors provided many supplies, while Indian agents managed rations and annuity disbursements. The buildup therefore combined structural drivers and immediate catalysts. Treaties and federal acts created the legal architecture for settlement. Railroads, mines, and commercial hunters altered ecological and economic baselines. Administrative shifts transformed everyday governance at agencies and schools. And winter stress arrests and ration disputes converted structural pressure into local violence. Read together, these strands explain why a pictograph selected by a keeper in any given winter might indicate a raid, a treaty, a loss of herd, or a disease year, because each pictograph is a concentrated index of the legal, economic, and logistical pressures that reshaped life on the plains. The first incident centers on the Bozeman Trail Theater in winter 1866. On December 21, 1806, a relief detachment sent from Fort Phil Kearny pursued a decoy party and was ambushed north of the fort. The entire detachment under Captain William Fetterman was wiped out in what the Army called a slaughter, and Plains leaders treated as a successful large-scale operation against a vulnerable post. The engagement was not an isolated tactical shock. It exposed the fragility of small garrisons guarding an intrusive overland route, raised the immediate demand for reinforcements and repeat patrols, and sent urgent dispatches along the thin chain of couriers and telegraph stations that linked frontier forts to departmental headquarters. Carrington's dispatches and subsequent Army inquiries show how the military signal chain pickets to fort commanders, to riders to telegraph at Fort Laramie, introduced delay and political friction, even as civilian press and congressional reaction amplified the event. Winter weather mattered. The morning of December 21st was clear and cold. Severe winter conditions in the region meant that relief and reinforcement would be constrained by horses' frozen prairie and limited forage. That seasonality shaped decisions on both sides. Lakota and allied warriors knew that a decisive strike before winter breakup could maximize dispersal effects. The post-shortage of horses and the difficulties of long-range scouting constrained Fort Phil Kearny's options. The immediate effects were concrete panic within the garrison. An urgent request for reinforcements accelerated calls to arm and provision wagon trains, and within months, a strategic reassessment that culminated in the abandonment of the Bozeman Trail forts in 1868. Do you send me reinforcements forthwith? Henry B. Carrington, Official Report. Fort Philip Kearny, December 21, 1866. The second incident is the 1874 Black Hills Expedition under Lieutenant Colonel George A. Custer, and the cascade of signals that followed its field reports. Ordered out in June 1874 to examine the Black Hills for a military post and resources, Custer's column included cavalry wagons, civilian scouts, and embedded reporters, whose dispatches and photographs returned quickly to Army headquarters and to Eastern presses. The Custer reports and the accompanying press coverage amplified field intelligence into broader political pressure. Gold reports transmitted by mounted couriers and telegraphed dispatches produced a rapid influx of prospectors and squatters across treaty lines. That sudden civilian movement transformed what had been administrative contact into an on-the-ground settler incursion that directly challenged the Fort Laramie 1868 boundaries. Here, the signal chains behaved differently, but no less consequentially. Military orders flowed down from department headquarters in St. Paul and Fort Lincoln, Field journals and photographs flowed outward via express riders and the telegraph. Railroad spokes and depot nodes enabled faster movement of miners and supplies to the Dakota edge. The material consequence was immediate miners staking claims camps springing up at creek mouths and a rapid market-driven depletion of resources that had been commons for hunting bands. Agency officials and Indian agents recorded surging complaints. Commissioners moved into treaty negotiation postures. Dispatches asking for military protection of civilian prospectors increased the pace of official pressure on bands to cede or sell. The third incident is the series of diplomatic and administrative moves in 1875 and 1876 that turned commercial incursion and military reconnaissance into open crisis. After the 1874 expedition, federal commissioners pressed attempts to purchase the Black Hills in 1875 and 1876. When negotiation failed, the government tightened pressure through a combination of military patrols, treaty commissioners' ultimatums, and the conditional suspension or delay of annuities and rations tied to the 1868 treaty. The political logic was clear. If the bands would not agree to cede the Black Hills, the government would escalate coercive measures that included cutting supplies and restricting movement until compliance followed. These actions were relayed through agency interpreters, Indian agents, and a stream of letters and reports that often introduced translation delay or interpretive friction, each delay producing a new layer of mistrust. Seasonality again shaped outcomes. Summer council attempts to negotiate sessions contended with dispersed spring and summer hunting camps. Interpreters and agents sometimes could not locate principal leaders who were on seasonal buffalo drives. Telegraphed directives arrived in agencies whose local staffs lacked immediate travel capacity. Agents relied on couriers and interpreters whose schedules introduced critical lags. Where a commissioner expected an answer within days, the Lakota practice of dispersed seasonal council making required weeks. That mismatch in temporal regimes converted diplomatic pressure into perceived bad faith. The immediate effects were severe bands that had remained neutral or ambivalent grew suspicious and in some cases preemptively moved camps. Agency recorders noted an uptick in horse seizures, reported skirmishes and crowding at agency stores when winter shortages followed poor hunts. Across these incidents, a pattern emerges about signals and delay. Telegraph and railroad accelerated the movement of information and of civilians, but they did not eliminate on-the-ground lags caused by season place and the need for interpreters. Courier rides could take days and in winter be interrupted. Telegraph lines ran to depots, not to dispersed camps. An interpreter's absence could stall council outcomes. Those frictions mattered because they transformed administrative orders into local shocks. A ration cut announced by telegraph at departmental headquarters translated after weeks into reduced food at an agency store, and then immediately into winter stress for a dependent camp. The keeper selecting a winter count pictograph therefore chose an image that captured not only a single event, but the compound of legal directives, communications delays, logistical shortfalls, and seasonal hardship that together produced crisis. Immediate local consequences from these rising incidents show a repeated sequence, an external intrusion or administrative change, a communication lag or interpreter failure, localized seizure or punitive action, and a rapid social response displacement, consolidation of bands for defense or retaliatory raids, leading to military counter-expeditions. In the record of winter counts, those sequences appear as war years, cattle years, epidemic years, or treaty years, depending on the keeper's perspective. Reading the counts alongside the dated incidents above therefore reveals not only chronology, but the causal chain that made a given winter memorable for a community. In sum, these three dated incidents, the Fetterman ambush, December 1806, the Custer Black Hills expedition, summer 1874, and the treaty and ration escalations, 1875 to 1876, illustrate how tactical events, administrative policy, and communication regimes combined with seasonal logistics to escalate contestation across the northern plains. Each incident left a footprint on local memory dense enough to be named by a keeper, and therefore to appear as a winter count pictograph that future elders and historians must read with attention to provenance timing and the chain of signals that linked field action to policy consequence. In the summer of 1860, the confrontation on the northern plains moved from contested diplomacy into convergent campaigns. Military columns, civilian prospectors, and reservation administrations all pressed the same geographic seam. The combat axis that most directly intersected winter count memory runs from Fort Abraham Lincoln in Dakota Territory through the Rosebud and Little Bighorn corridors to the hunting grounds of the Black Hills. The principal United States formation was the 7th Cavalry Regiment of the United States Army under the departmental command structure that placed columns under Generals Alfred H. Terry, John Gibbon, and George Crook. Lieutenant Colonel George A. Custer led a tactical battalion drawn from the regiment into direct contact with a large encampment of Lakota Sioux and Northern Cheyenne near the Little Bighorn River on June 25, 1876. On the indigenous side, multiple Lakota bands, Northern Cheyenne, and allied Arapaho assembled under war leaders whose guidance and coordination did not conform to a single formal order of battle, yet produced an effective combined defensive force in the field. Order of battle rendered in prose, the United States fielded 3 largely independent columns in the summer campaign of 1876. Major Marcus Reno commanded a battalion of companies drawn from the 7th Cavalry, charged with initial reconnaissance and river crossing operations. Captain Frederick Benteen commanded a separate battalion ordered to reconsolidate and support. Lieutenant Colonel George A. Custer detached 5 companies from the 7th Cavalry for the direct attack element while leaving a pack train under Captain Thomas McDougall to follow at a distance. Supporting elements included Crow and Arikara scouts attached to the regiment. The slower pack train of wagons carrying forage and ammunition and departmental telegraph and quartermaster links that traced back to Fort Lincoln and the railroad spine. Contemporary musters and later regimental lists indicate the regiment's total authorized strength in the theater approached several hundred to near 800 men, but Custer's forward detachment numbered roughly 210 men on the day of separation from Reno and Benteen. The march is best read as sequenced moves tied to terrain and season. Custer's column left Fort Abraham Lincoln on June 7, 1876, and moved southwest across rolling shortgrass prairie. The route crossed the Little Missouri and Rosebud watersheds and then followed ridgelines and draws that funneled movement through limited crossing points above the Little Bighorn. These choke points, river fords, wooded coulees, and the timbered corridors along the Little Bighorn shaped both movement and sight lines. Crow and Arikara scouts warned of a large village discovered on the Little Bighorn. Custer's tactical decision compressed his march into a day assault plan that depended on surprise and the regiment's mobility but left limited capacity for reserves or resupply in broken terrain. The river corridor itself created a decisive geometry. An attack from the south and east exposed columns to counter moves along high ground that indigenous defenders could occupy and conceal behind timber belts. Rules of engagement and arrest orders in the summer 1876 campaign derived from both departmental directives and emergency political decisions. Departmental marching orders from General Alfred Terry set the operational mission locate, and if necessary, force bands deemed non-compliant with treaty requirements onto reservations and protect civilian population and railroad interests. After the Little Bighorn defeat, Congress attached a rider to the Indian Appropriations Act of August 15, 1876, conditioning appropriations on cession or submission, a legal lever later described in litigation as the sell or starve provision. The statute's operative language was blunt hereafter: there shall be no appropriation made for the subsistence of the Sioux unless they relinquished hunting grounds or ceded the Black Hills. That congressional measure became an enforcement instrument separate from immediate battlefield orders and shifted the confrontation into a combined military-political squeeze. First contact in the Custer episode occurred on June 25, 1876, with Reno's crossing of the Little Bighorn and his initial attack through timbered low ground. Reno's assault ran into a larger-than-anticipated concentration of lodges and militia. His withdrawal across the river to an interpreted defensive ridge set the stage for Custer's independent move northward. Custer advanced along ridge lines, encountering dispersed skirmishing. Within hours, he divided his 5 companies into multiple assault elements in an attempt to outflank what he believed to be a smaller contingent. Indigenous leaders counter-maneuvered massing warriors on interior lines, using concealment in coulees and breastworks fashioned from dead animals and earth to blunt frontal attacks and then to envelop exposed detachments. Archaeological patterns and battlefield forensics indicate running fights across ridges and a final clustered resistance on the hills Custer occupied. Maneuvers on both sides illustrate different operational logic. The United States cavalry relied on linear movement speed, single-day marches, and the shock value of concentrated dismounted infantry fire. Its tactics required maintaining supply contact and a clear route for mounted withdrawal. Indigenous tactics favored dispersal concentration and sudden massing at decisive points. Scouts detected movement, then called warriors back from hunting ranges to assemble rapidly. Concealment in timber and use of flanking run lines exploited the cavalry's need to remain visible to maintain formation cohesion. Logistic stress for the United States fell into 2 categories: sustainment, the pack train and forage for horses, limited by prairie forage and wagon breakdowns and information couriers and scouts whose reports could lag or misinterpret village dispositions. For indigenous bands, logistics centered on mobility horses to move camp, and warriors' caches and immediate subsistence drawn from the surrounding plains. When seasons were poor, however, foraging pressures increased, and the capacity to fight for extended campaigns diminished. Casualty ranges are a focal evidence point and are well documented for the June 25 to 26 engagement. United States losses for the 7th Cavalry in the encounter total approximately 268 dead and 55 wounded when counting the full complement engaged across Reno-Benteen and Custer episodes. Custer's immediate command of roughly 210 men was annihilated on the final ridgelines. Contemporary Army musters, post-battle, and Court of Inquiries records provide these tallies and were later consolidated in regimental reports. Estimates of indigenous casualties vary widely in primary testimony and remain contested. Contemporary Lakota and Cheyenne accounts gave figures that range from small numbers to over 100 killed and many more wounded, while modern battlefield archaeology suggests lower lethal counts and higher wounded proportions than some early narratives indicated. These differences matter because winter counts and oral reports compress the human toll into emblematic images rather than enumerated casualty lists. Non-combatant outcomes were immediate and tragic. Reno's initial engagement appears to have caused collateral deaths among women and children present at the camp's periphery, and subsequent military recoveries documented unnamed women and children listed among the season's fatalities. Humanitarian consequences extended beyond battlefield fatalities. The defeat prompted expedient congressional and executive responses that increased Army deployments, curtailed annuities, and hastened forced movements of entire bands away from traditional wintering grounds, producing displacement and acute winter stress for non-combatants. The policy lever of conditional appropriations transformed a military defeat into a fiscal instrument that pressed families toward relocation or starvation. Logistics stress in the aftermath became explicit. A surge of troops poured into the theater, but supply lines were thin. Wagon trains struggled to keep up across hot, dusty summers and then through early winter snows. Rations intended for reservation populations were diverted for military use, at times producing shortages at agencies. Administratively, the Department of the Interior and the Bureau of Indian Affairs were swept into emergency management roles, converting ration schedules into political tools. Agents who once administered annuities found their discretion narrowed by congressional riders and military requisition. The combined effect fell disproportionately on non-combatants who relied on annuities and agency stores during poor hunting seasons. Two short contemporaneous documents capture operational and legal immediacies. From the field, Henry B. Carrington, on December 21, 1866, wrote in the Fetterman episode, "Do send me reinforcements forthwith." Henry B. Carrington, Official Report, Fort Philip Kearny, December 21, 1866. And from the statutory response after Little Bighorn, the 1876 appropriations language stated in effect hereafter, "There shall be no appropriation made for the subsistence of Sioux bands unless they ceded their hunting grounds, a conditional legal deprivation Congress used to compel compliance." Act of August 15, 1876, Indian Appropriations Act, United States Congress, August 15, 1876. Fact versus folklore disputes appear repeatedly in campaign memory. Fact: the Army abandoned the Bozeman Trail forts as an outcome of the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. Sources and treaty text confirm the withdrawal and subsequent burning of posts. Folklore casualty counts in earlier 19th century engagements, including Fetterman, sometimes circulate as rounded heroic numbers, e.g., 100 slain, that vary by retelling. Primary muster rolls refine those tallies and slightly lower some figures. Fact: Custer's tactical decision to split forces on June 25, 1876 is established in surviving orders and court of inquiry testimony. Folklore narratives that cast Custer as singly reckless or, alternatively, as a victim of betrayal simplify a complex battlefield geometry and omit the concurrent mobilization and intelligence variables that shaped outcomes. Winter count pictographs reflect this tension. An image commemorating a great fight is factual in marking a major year, but folkloric in how a single symbol may aggrandize or compress multiple related events. The campaign and confrontation on the plains therefore combined kinetic battlefield engagements with statute-driven enforcement. Tactical maneuvers across ridgelines and river fords produced immediate lethal outcomes. Simultaneous congressional riders and agency enforcement produced structural deprivation. For communities that would later select a single pictograph to mark the winter, the memorable event might be a battlefield, a cut in rations, or a burned lodge. But the full story of cause and consequence always runs across both the combat path and the legal policy path. The decisive turning point on the northern plains in this sequence occurred in the late summer and autumn of 1876 when a battlefield victory for some Lakota and Cheyenne warriors, the defeat of Lieutenant Colonel George A. Custer's immediate command on June 25, 1876, was rapidly transformed into a political and logistical strategy by the United States that shifted initiative away from on-the-ground tactics to statutory coercion and supply denial. The battle itself at the Little Bighorn River in southeastern Montana Territory remains a tactical datum dated June 25 to 26, 1876. What made that moment a structural turning point was the United States response in law and administration in the months that followed. Who and where? The actors were clear Lakota Sioux bands, Northern Cheyenne and allied Arapaho assembled on the Little Bighorn and by local count repelled Custer's forward elements. The broader U.S. effort responding across the theater involved the Department of the Missouri, the 7th Cavalry detachments, and a political coalition in Congress and the executive branch seeking to secure the Black Hills and protect civilian claimants and railroad interests. The legal instrument that crystallized the turn came with the Indian Appropriations Action of August 1876, and the commissions dispatched immediately thereafter to extract a cession or secure submission. Objective and constraints. For United States policymakers and the Army, the objective after June 1876 rapidly became clear to compel cessation of large free-range encampments which sheltered non-compliant warriors, to secure the Black Hills for prospecting interests, and to force bans onto reservation economies that colonial administrators could manage. Constraints were logistical, and political troop numbers were limited across a wide theater. Supply and forage for horses were thin. Seasonal movement of cavalry and wagon trains suffered from prairie choke points and early winter weather, and Congress faced public pressure from eastern constituencies demanding both retribution and protection for settlers and miners. Administratively, the Department of the Interior and Indian agents operated under a narrowed budgetary discretion as Congress debated appropriations. Political consensus for hard measures to coerce cession grew rapidly after the battle. Immediate effect, initiative shift. The immediate operational effect after Congress's August measures was to convert battlefield momentum into fiscal leverage. Where previously the federal state had relied largely on cavalry patrols and negotiated annuities, it now wielded the purse as a coercive instrument. Rations and subsistence appropriations were conditioned on the Sioux ceasing hostilities and surrendering claims to contested lands. That conditionality produced a strategic squeeze large portions of the population who relied seasonally on annuities and agency supplies faced the imminent prospect of food shortages as winter approached. The shift of initiative was therefore not simply military reinforcement, but a deliberate administrative policy that aimed to compel movement and settlement through material deprivation as much as by force of arms. Evidence and logistics. Evidence for the policy turn is statutory and documentary. The Act of August 15, 1876, and its writers explicitly limited appropriations and conditioned future subsistence on cession or accommodation. The Many-Penny Commission that followed carried pre-drafted treaty text into Sioux country and pressed leaders with an ultimatum backed by the specter of withheld supplies. The logistics picture is stark wagon trains, and quartermaster links had to support growing troop concentrations, while agency stores that had previously fed reservation populations were redirected or placed under new authority. Archival appropriation texts and the Many-Penny Commission reports document both the legal change and the administrative mechanics by which rations were to be withheld or reallocated. Admission against interest, primary, fragment, then continue, narration. The commissioners brought with them the text of a treaty that had been prepared in advance. Many-Penny Commission Report. Sioux Country, September 1876. Human cost and displacement path. The human toll of the turning point operated at two scales. Immediately, it meant combat deaths and the well-documented loss of Lieutenant Colonel Custer and roughly 210 soldiers in his forward command. United States regimental records and battlefield archaeology place the 7th Cavalry's total theater losses at approximately 268 killed with additional wounded. For indigenous communities, the cost was measured differently. Lives were lost in skirmishes and raids, but the larger cost was rapid displacement. Bands that had ranged freely from the Black Hills to the Powder River and the Rosebud found their wintering grounds imperiled. Many moved to agency lands at Standing Rock, Cheyenne River, Pine Ridge, and Rosebud as the federal state tightened control. Non-combatant suffering followed, agency ration shortfalls, winter exposure, and the erosion of subsistence mobility increased mortality risk among elders, women and children as the 1876 to 1877 winter year approached. Fact versus counterfactual evidence-based. The counterfactual hinge is narrow yet instructive if Congress had declined to attach conditional appropriation riders in August 1876 and instead funded an extended negotiated settlement with guarantees for subsistence support, the immediate incentive structure facing bands would have been different, at least in the short term. There would have been less pressure to accept cession. Conversely, if the Army had had substantially larger numbers and a sustained logistical train in the summer of 1876, a different set of punitive operations might have unfolded that could have exacted larger territorial concessions earlier. Both counterfactuals highlight that the turning point was as much an administrative policy choice as a battlefield outcome. Personal names and motifs in winter counts. Specific names anchor the human narrative. Sitting Bull as a central spiritual and political figure, Crazy Horse who led coupled resistance moves, and Custer whose death became the emblematic United States loss in June 1876. In many local winter counts, the motif chosen for 1876 and adjacent winters is not a detailed casualty list, but a compressed emblem, a great fight, pictograph, a starvation or cut rations motif, or an image of the taking of the hills, each signifying the combined shock of combat and subsequent deprivation. Those motifs map directly onto the displacement paths described above: summer encampments broken up by military moves and legal coercion, winter migrations toward reservation agencies where the presence of rations and schools announced a new settled order. Synthesis back to P2 structural forces. The turning point demonstrates how the structural forces identified in causes and buildup converge. Land and resource pressure. Miners and railheads pushing into the Black Hills created the immediate zone of contest. Policy and administrative shifts, transfer of Indian affairs into an interior regime, and the use of appropriations as leverage provided the legal means. And logistical constraints limited forage for horses, fragile wagon trains, thin troop numbers, and seasonal weather shaped the operational options available to both sides. When those forces intersected with immediate triggers, the Custer engagement and subsequent press and congressional outrage, the federal government moved from negotiated settlement models to conditional fiscal coercion. In effect, the P2 dynamics explain why the 1876 turning point did not end with a single battlefield result, but produced a structural realignment of the plains sovereign. Seasonal mobility was displaced by reservation dependency and statutory compulsion. In short, the Little Bighorn fight mattered not solely as a tactical defeat for a United States detachment, but as the trigger that allowed federal policy to weaponize subsistence itself. That administrative choice produced the displacement paths and winter count motifs that recur as the defining marks of late 19th century Northern Plains memory. The legal and administrative aftermath of the 1870s campaign cycle remade the map of the Northern Plains at once on paper and on the ground. Federal statutes and commission reports of 1876 to 1807 modified the Fort Laramie framework and, in effect, abrogated prior reservation boundaries by conditioning subsistence and appropriations on cession and compliance. The Act of February 28, 1807 implemented the Many-Penny Commission Agreement and followed the earlier appropriations rider of August 1876 that cut off annuities until bands agreed to new terms. Those statutes converted immediate military contests into long-term legal dispossession. Administration enforced the new order through arrests, transfers, and tighter agency oversight. Indian agents and military detachments enforced movement restrictions, supervised annuity distribution, and recorded compliance. Judicial dockets and territorial courts handled trespass and property disputes arising from settler encroachment and often produced criminal arrests of indigenous individuals accused under local statutes. At the same time, the Department of the Interior's expanding role meant civilian agents assumed greater control over schooling and allotment plans, even as the Army retained expeditionary authority when civil measures produced resistance. The cumulative administrative pathway accelerated the shift from seasonal mobility to fixed reservation dependency and shaped how winter count communities would mark subsequent winters. Land and resource regimes changed in measurable ways. The Black Hills were effectively seized for prospecting and settlement after the 1874 expedition and the subsequent 1807 Act. Rail spurs and supply nodes followed survey lines and encouraged leasing, grazing, and mining claims that made traditional wintering ranges inaccessible. The larger federal policy arc from treaty reservation recognition toward allotment and privatization enacted under the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887 reduced communal landholdings and opened residual property to non-Indian sale and lease. The Dawes framework further fragmented collective land bases and undercut the mobility that had structured Plains subsistence. Demography and public health reveal another set of continuities. Epidemics that winter counts had long recorded smallpox, influenza, and later measles and tuberculosis continued to shape population patterns into the reservation era. Mortality spikes combined with displacement and food insecurity produced documented census declines in some bands and altered age-sex structures in others. Government mortality registers missionary correspondence and reservation. Physician reports register these shifts. Thus, a winter count pictograph marking a disease year can often be aligned with external health records to recover proximate demographic impact. The near extirpation of bison by commercial hunters through the 1870s and 1880s further amplified nutritional stress and was a proximate cause of seasonal food insecurity recorded in both winter counts and agency rations ledgers. Education and cultural policy added a persistent layer of social engineering. Off-reservation boarding schools founded in the late 19th century, exemplified by the Carlisle Indian Industrial School model, removed children from family and ceremonial cycles and placed them into regimented industrial training that sought to break language transmission and ritual continuity. School placement records, boarding school correspondence, and survivor testimony document forced removals that reconfigured family structures and reduced opportunities for oral transmission of winter count narratives to new generations. The boarding school regime thereby intersected with reservation dependency to compress long-term cultural effects. Cultural continuance adapted and persisted despite these pressures. Winter counts themselves were copied, preserved, and in some cases reinterpreted. Ledger art emerged as a 19th century visual prose in which artists recorded campaign memory and ceremonial continuities on paper and ledger book pages. Ceremonial life persisted in adapted forms. Seasonal movements became constrained, but ritual calendars continued. Language use contracted in some communities but survived in household contexts and ceremonial settings. Contemporary museum conservation projects and tribal education programs emphasize repatriation, preservation, and teaching initiatives that seek to re-anchor winter counts in community contexts rather than museum display alone. Memory and legal continuance intersect in modern litigation and tribal political practice. The Sioux Nation's long-standing claim over the Black Hills culminated in the Court of Claims and Supreme Court decisions of the late 20th century, which recognized the taking and awarded monetary compensation, a judgment the tribes have largely declined to accept because cash payment would extinguish the land claim. The 1980 Supreme Court decision in United States v. Sioux Nation of Indians established just compensation liability, but tribal political strategy has continued to prioritize land return and sacred site protection over acceptance of funds. That ongoing legal posture underpins contemporary advocacy and legislative efforts around the Black Hills and informs local commemoration practices rooted in treaty memory. Present day, autonyms, locations, and programs. Oglala Lakota autonym, Oglala Lakota communities remain principally based on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. Northern Cheyenne autonym, Northern Cheyenne populations reside primarily on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation in southeastern Montana. Standing Rock Sioux Tribe autonym, Standing Rock Sioux Tribe, occupies lands in North Dakota and South Dakota and administers a range of tribal programs, including health education, judicial, and restorative services. Contemporary tribal governments run cultural preservation, language revitalization, and youth programs that explicitly incorporate winter count knowledge and archival engagement into curricula and repatriation initiatives. Tribal program pages and recent tribal-led conservation initiatives document this active continuity of cultural stewardship. Ongoing legal and cultural programs illustrate continuance. Tribal courts and attorneys pursue land use and treaty claims, while tribal education departments collaborate with museums to repatriate winter counts and associated ceremonial objects under policies informed by NAGPRA and interinstitutional agreements. Community cultural centers sponsor winter count workshops, ledger art apprenticeships, and digitization projects that place high-resolution images and keeper lineages into tribal archives. Simultaneously, litigation and political advocacy around boarding school legacies and reparative accounting have become active fronts for tribal governments and intertribal coalitions in the 21st century. In sum, the aftermath of the 1870s campaigns established durable administrative and legal architectures that redirected land use and resource access. It restructured demography and public health outcomes. It institutionalized schooling regimes that interrupted oral transmission. And it provoked cultural adaptation that preserved ritual knowledge even as practices shifted. Winter counts and ledger art remain central to this continuity. They are documentary forms that both remember the sequence of dispossession and provide communities with a visual archive that supports contemporary cultural and legal revival. The records cited above treaty and appropriation statutes, court decisions, boarding school histories, bison and public health studies, museum, winter count conservation files, and tribal program repositories together show how 19th century events continue to produce legal contestation, cultural resilience, and living programs of reclamation today. Scholarly consensus on the late 19th century Northern Plains campaigns coalesces around three principal conclusions. First, tactical outcomes such as the June 25 to 26, 1876 engagement at the Little Bighorn represent valid battlefield victories for Lakota and Northern Cheyenne forces in specific engagements, but these victories did not reverse the larger structural trajectory of dispossession driven by federal policy and economic expansion. Second, the federal response after 1876, combining increased military deployment with conditional appropriation riders and accelerated treaty pressure, demonstrates that political and fiscal instruments often proved as decisive as battlefield force in terminating seasonal mobility and enforcing reservation dependence. Third, indigenous documentary forms, including winter counts and ledger art, are essential complementary sources. When read with provenance and oral performance in view, they reshape chronological narratives derived solely from federal records. Key contested points persist among historians and in public memory. Casualty figures and their distribution remain debated. United States regimental records and contemporary musters consistently document approximately 268 killed in the 7th Cavalry Theater, while indigenous casualty estimates in contemporary oral testimony and later memorial accounts vary and often emphasize non-combatant suffering. Modern battlefield archaeology refines but does not entirely settle these disparities. The assessment of individual command choices remains contested. Some military historians emphasize Custer's tactical misreading of terrain and intelligence. Other analysts stress concurrent logistical constraints and the limits of available command and control in a dispersed theater. Finally, the question of long-term impact elicits competing emphases. One camp stresses immediate policy hardening and land loss as direct consequences. Another highlights longer continuities of indigenous resilience, cultural adaptation, and legal resistance that complicated any simple narrative of unilateral defeat. Enduring legacy appears in three registers. Militarily and administratively, the campaigns precipitated doctrinal shifts in frontier operations, greater synchronization of troop concentrations, supply chains, and telegraphic command, paired with the use of appropriations as a coercive policy tool. Legally and economically, the period accelerated dispossession through cession enforcement railroad spurs and the privatization of formerly communal ranges, culminating in allotment-era reforms. Culturally, the episode became a focal symbol in competing memories, a martial emblem in settler narratives, and a marker of sovereignty resistance and loss in indigenous registers, preserved visually in winter counts, ledger art, and later commemorative practice. Representative viewpoints persist in productive tension, military operational accounts that emphasize logistics and battlefield geometry, legal administrative studies that trace statutory leverage and fiscal coercion, and indigenous scholarship that centers oral performance provenance and the meanings of winter count motifs. The event endures in memory because it crystallized a moment when battlefield action and federal policy converged to transform seasonal sovereignty into statutory dependency, a transformation recorded forever in both official archives and indigenous visual chronologies. This episode followed the keeper's tiny image from hide to full season of events and decisions. Whose perspective changed how you understand that winter, the keeper, the agent, or the soldier? Share your view below. Thanks for watching.